trying to move in and set up your own operation, if you didn't already have access to woody forests and hills and a good balance of oak and chestnut trees, it would be pretty much impossible. Now, especially with the Chinese picture, things are changing. If the Chinese can get on the business, who's next? So there's real uncertainty about who might be coming into the truffle business in the future. How about buyers? Well, interestingly, the statistics show that the buyers might be on the increase. Not only as the developing world becomes more wealthy, are there more people who could afford truffles, but in fact, the status and appeal associated with truffles, according to the food industry, is on the increase. Part of that is because restaurants look for ways to charge more, but the average restaurant customer won't accept blind price increases. You throw a truffle on a hamburger, though, and you might be able to increase the price of the hamburger without any customers complaining. So there actually, for the first time in probably the modern world, there's actually an increase in the customers for the truffle business. Substitutes. I kind of think this misses the point. If somebody wants truffles, they're not really looking for substitutes. And then industry competitors. This is a viciously competitive industry. If you're a truffle producer in France and Italy, you are probably up there with pirates in terms of your aggressiveness, right? In fact, last year there was a robbery at a secluded high-end restaurant in the south of France. The thieves came in helicopters and were armed in body armor. They stormed the restaurant and the kitchen and stole their entire stockpile of truffles. It was the equivalent of planning that goes into a Las Vegas casino heist. And even though they couldn't figure out who did it, almost everyone suspected that it was the next farmer over. Competitive. Then we can go outside the industry dynamics and start to look at these big factors that might be playing. So macroeconomics. Are people getting richer? Are economies stagnating? Do we think people in 5 years, when our business is up and running, will have the money to even be thinking about truffles? Technology. The biggest thing keeping out the new entrants is technology right now. The first person to figure out how to grow truffles with quality equal to those in France and Italy found wild is going to destroy the price of truffles in the industry. Now, on the positive side, people have been trying to do this for 100 years, so maybe it's not that easy. But it's definitely something to consider. Regulation. So in France and Italy, you're golden, right? The regulations are super clear. It's clear what a truffle is. It's clear what a truffle has to come from. It's clear what you can sell on the market as a truffle. But in the rest of the world, not so clear. In fact, some studies suggest that most of the people who claim they don't like truffles and aren't willing to pay for truffles have never actually eaten a real truffle. But they don't know that, because in most of the world, you can sell pretty much anything and call it a truffle. Customer preferences. It's not clear if customers even like truffles. They like to say that they're buying truffles. They like to see truffles on the menu. But that could just be a fad, right? Basically, truffles are marketed as any other luxury product would be marketed, which means that when people decide that they're not luxurious enough, the value for them disappears. So in a snapshot, in about 5 minutes, I outlined the situation here. All the major factors that are playing in on this industry, and that you need to know and have a good control of before you even start thinking about developing your own organizational strategy. You should be able to communicate the dynamics in your own industry just as clearly as that to somebody who has never even heard of your industry. So once you can do that, what do you do next? It's a good question. Said resume or force quit. I'm just going to keep on while they work on this. So once you start to paint the picture of your industry and the snapshot of your industry in time, which highlights the different forces that are working here, which lets you talk about the dynamics in the industry without even thinking about you specifically, or your capabilities, or your weaknesses, just thinking about the competitive landscape. The next step is to start thinking about you specifically, right? So how are you going to compete in the space where you want to compete? Some people call this developing a business concept. And the idea is that you have to go further than just having a sense for the industry, and you actually have to be able to talk about the specifics of what's going on. We often envision this kind of like a matrix, and really a three-dimensional matrix. The first question to ask is, where are you going to compete? And in some ways, this is the identity question for you. It answers the question, who are you as an organization? The second question to ask is, how are you going to compete? And this really is telling you what you do. So you know who you are, now you know what you do. And the third question is when to compete. This is to figure out your timing, the variables involved, and when to act. What I love about thinking about things first through the situational analysis, and then through this where to compete, how to compete, when to compete framework, is that it really is scalable to all different types of organizations. So I don't care whether you're a for-profit multinational company or you're a small local nonprofit. The same questions apply. The same strategic thinking applies. And because of that scalability, this becomes basically a language that anyone can use, that applies to everyone. So let's start with the first axis of the matrix, where to compete. And we may have visuals again soon. When we're thinking about where to compete, we're really trying to define who we are, our sense of identity as an organization. And when we start doing this, we think about 5 key dimensions that come off of the question, where to compete. The first is to think about your customers. And when we're thinking about this, we're really thinking about a broad question. Who are your customers? Who are you trying to serve? What we often don't also ask is who is not our customer? Who do we not care about? Who are we not trying to serve? Because most organizations are not trying to serve everyone. The second question is about channel. What are the channels where I operate? And this is important because how you reach your consumers is kind of critical in thinking about who your consumers could possibly be. The third idea is to think about product. And this isn't how do I make my product, how do I create my product. It's really a step back. What is my product? And how does that influence who I am, what my identity is as a company? So for example, it's not good enough to just say, I'm going to be a car maker, right? Instead, you have to go a step further. I'm going to be a luxury car maker, or I'm going to be an ultra high-end, extremely high-performance car maker, right? When you tell me that, I actually know a lot about you. I can start to predict the costs that you have. I can start to predict who your customers are. I can start to think about how you market yourself. I can start to think about how your growth is going to look like over the short, medium, and long haul. I know a lot about you once I know specifically what your product is. The next question is about vertical integration. So in every industry, there are questions about how much of the entire value chain you're going to control, you're going to own. Some of this is about the question of multi-layers of suppliers and then you. Some of this falls into the how to compete. So how can I work with suppliers to get the most favorable pricing and then influence that into my costs? Some of it, though, is about who I am, really, as a company. Am I a huge company completely vertically integrated? That's going to mean one thing for the culture. Or am I just occupying one step in the value chain? One thing that I do better than anyone else and where I can eke out profit? There we go. So there's the matrix, and here's where we are now. And the final dimension of where to compete is the question of geographic market. And in some ways, this is the easiest question. Physically, where do I compete? Am I a local company confined to Kuwait City? Am I a regional company trying to attack the Middle East? Am I a pan-regional company trying to attack the developing world? Am I global? What is my geographic bounds? So recently I was working with a nonprofit. It's called the French Alliance, or l'Alliance Française. They have chapters around the world. Almost every major city in the world has one. They're sponsored and to some degree funded and supported by the French government, almost as outreach efforts throughout the world. Their mandate is to spread French language and culture throughout the world. During the French colonial era, they were at the vanguard of teaching France's colonies French, so that the citizens of the colonies could communicate with people in France and share ideas. Now, it's more a nonprofit at a local level, with every city's French alliance being pretty much autonomous to figure out their own strategy, their own competitive space. When I moved to Kansas City, the head of the Kansas City Alliance Française approached me, knowing that I had spent time in France, and asking me to help with some of the challenges that they were currently facing. The more I talked to her, the more I realized what she was really asking me is, who are we? Right? There are many possible things we could be doing, we could spending our time with, we could be recruiting, but what is it that we really do? So I sat her down and we worked through this model. At first she was reluctant because she said, no, I know this model, this is for companies. But I told her, no, be patient. This is just a way of structuring your thoughts. And it applies just as well to a nonprofit like yours as it would to a large company going through a formal strategic planning process. The first question is, who are your customers? Who do you serve? Now for them, these aren't actual customers. They're not buying anything. She's not selling anything. But these are the people that are considered part of the Alliance Française. There's a question as to who those should be, though. She explained to me that in the past, it had mainly been about 10 French-born women who were now living in Kansas City. And they basically had a dinner club together. That was the customers. But there was a faction within the organization that believed, in fact, the true customers should be people who have no knowledge of France or the French language. Their job should be reaching out to new people to educate them about France, right? Even members of the same organization had different definitions of who their customers were. They also had real questions about what their product was, right? They couldn't tell you what they did. If they're an organization that's supposed to provide cultural support to French expats living in the United States, then a typical event should look like something like a movie night or dinner at someone's house. It should be a way of bringing together the French community in order to give them support and encouragement and new opportunities for socialization. But if their goal is to expand French culture and influence to Kansas City, then their events should look different. They should be providing language training to people without language ability. They should be providing enrichment opportunities to the local schools. Their product should be different. Their vertical integration is actually interesting too. This is a problem almost all nonprofits have in particular. There's only so much they can do by themselves. So at some point they have to start thinking, to what degree do I want to partner? And who do I want to partner with? So in this case, vertical integration might not look like suppliers and buyers and a value chain. It might look like partnerships, alliances with other nonprofits. So do we partner with the city's diversity organizations? Do we partner with universities and educational institutions? Or do we go it alone and be l'Alliance Française standing on our own, right? Real questions. And the answers to these, because there is no right or wrong answer, can't come from the outside. We've all worked with consultants who've been hired to come in and give us a strategic plan. How often does it actually work? The answers to these questions have to come from within. Who do you want to be? What does your organization want to be? The second major dimension is how to compete. And this is really telling you what you do. Again, I think about 4 different sub-dimensions for this. The first is a question of your value proposition to your customers. What do you give them, what benefit, and what does it cost them, right? Kind of simple in its idea, strangely complex in its execution. The second question is how you're going to stay ahead of your competitors. What is your competitive advantage? The third question, and this doesn't apply to all industries or all companies, is the question of how you're going to fit into the value chain. If you're just going to completely vertically integrate, this isn't a relevant question. But if you're going to have lots of partnerships, alliances, if you're going to buy and sell, you need to know how you're going to do that. What does your industry chain look like? And finally, you have to think outside your organization. Who are your stakeholders? Often this means the government, right? This is where you start to think specifically about how your tactics, how you operate, is going to be influenced by regulation, by tax policy, by monetary policy, by the strength of the courts and the reliability of commercial prosecution, right? So this is actually something that universities around the world are really thinking hard about right now. As the world becomes smaller, and universities are rising up all around the world, competing for the world's best students, the best talent, universities have had to think really hard about what they do. They know what they are, right? Universities go back hundreds and hundreds of years. There's a real global sense of what a university is. But what a university does is being contested. Does a company based entirely on the internet with no physical locations that offers online lectures and online exams graded by 1,000 people distributed around the world, is that a university? Depends who you ask. Does a university operate locally? If a university has chapters around the world, is that still a university? What does a university do? So in particular, universities are thinking about 3 of these questions really hard. The first is the question of customers. What is the value proposition of a university education? A lot of this recently has come down to the question of, do college graduates make more money? Because that's an easy thing to prove. If it's true that people with a college education or people with a graduate school education, and in fact it is true, that they actually make more money over their lifetime, well then that's the value. You can say that to every student, you can say it to every parent. You are going to get your education because your kid will make more. But you can go deeper than that too, right? You can try to talk about non-monetary benefits of a college education. And in fact, the more sophisticated universities do come up with quite nuanced articulations of what the value of their education is. The second question, how do you keep ahead of your competitors? It used to be that universities had pretty much a monopoly over their local area. There were a few universities in the world that attracted people from other areas, but most universities catered to the local clientele. That's not the case anymore. People travel to the university. So there's a real question as to how each university is going to stay ahead. The answer most universities have to this point is rankings. More and more money and attention is going to rankings because that's how universities are staying ahead of their competition. The industry chain. For the first time in history, universities are partnering, and partnering at a rapid pace. Sometimes they're partnering down. So four-year universities are partnering with two-year junior colleges or community colleges or professional schools around the world, so that after the students are done there, if they want to continue on in their education, they can transfer easily into a four-year university. Universities in different countries are partnering with each other in order to trade their students and generate more revenue. Four-year universities in some parts of the world are partnering with high schools in other parts of the world in order to feed students in. Real partnerships here. And finally, perhaps the biggest thing facing university education, particularly in the United States and Europe, is the question of government funding. Once upon a time, universities were almost completely funded by their local governments. That's not the case anymore. So with government money making up less and less of the daily operating budget of the university, who's going to pay for it? So this is how the how to compete could break down for one specific institution in one specific industry. The ultimate goal of how to compete, of thinking through what you do, is to try to carve out pockets of competitive advantage. Competitive advantage has been reached when you can say three things are true. The first thing is that you can say your customers, the people you serve, the people you sell to, can tell a difference between different competitors in a market. If they can't tell a difference, there's no potential for competitive advantage. Everything's just a commodity, and they'll go with the one that costs less. The second they can tell a difference, that one product is better than another product, that one service is superior to another service, that's when you have the basis for competitive advantage. The second question is, can competitive advantage be obtained? Is it even possible? So this can come from different places. It could come from having unique access to raw materials. It could come from having the best people in an industry. And the final question is, can you keep it over time? Is this just one moment you have a competitive advantage and tomorrow it's gone? A rough and tumble, sort of uncertain emerging industry? Or is this an industry where things can be predicted over the long run? In general, we talk about competitive advantage in these 5 ways. The first are structural advantages. These are great when you can get them, right? This means that you have some sort of monopolistic control, something that no one else can take away. You're the only person located in a place where something has to happen. You're the only person who has legal protection to an idea that's necessary for a technology. You're the only person who has a mine access to important raw natural materials. The second one is momentum or reputation. This is where, for example, branding comes into play. If you have the strongest brand, if you have loyal consumers, if you have real energy around who you are and what you do, that can be a type of competitive advantage. Business system superiorities. Some people seek out their advantage by being able to do things best, being able to do things cheaper than anyone else can, being able to do things with a higher quality than anyone else can. Meta skills. We hear a lot of talk about this today. This is the idea that certain organizations actually have an edge on things like innovation, right? When we hear people talking about how, okay, a company doesn't actually produce much, it doesn't generate any revenues, but we're going to place a massive valuation on that company. It's usually because people are talking about a type of competitive advantage based in meta skills, that company has the right confluence of people, of talent, of background, that it's going to be a continual engine of innovation and growth. And a value can be placed on that. And finally, and perhaps most weakly, some organizations rely on behavioral restraint from their competitors. Why in the world would your competitor just choose to let you have a space? Well, there are industries where competitors feel that moving into your space could actually cannibalize their existing space. Or there are companies, you hear about them all the time, where maybe they have a strong CEO or founder or owner who just has no interest in expanding into a new space. So they're choosing voluntarily to let you have the market. The question is, can that be kept over time? Can you base a strategic plan on the restraint of your competitors? The final business concept or strategic planning question is, when do you compete? The answer I usually get from students is, well, when wouldn't you compete? Right? You have the opportunity to make some money, get out there and do it. But in fact, organizations spend a lot of time thinking about this question. It can involve different types of question. Perhaps most commonly, it's the question of market entry. When is the right time to enter a new market, launch a new product, attract or start a conversation with a new type of consumer? The second question is, when should we invest, right? Innovation involves trade-offs. It's usually costly. It's not a no-brainer that you should spend more money. So often this is a question of, when is it worth spending money, and when should we actually stand back on what we're already good at? The third question is, how quickly should we be innovating? Should we be funding constant innovation that is constantly yielding new companies, new products, new divisions? Or should we be focusing more on incremental change when it's necessary, when we start hitting a brick wall with our existing technology? And finally, there's the question of whether or not we're in the game of continuous innovation. Are we, going back to our competitive advantages, in a situation where we actually have a stable competitive advantage over time? Or are we in a situation where we think we might have to continuously rethink where our competitive advantage will come from? Which capabilities of our organization are going to be the basis for our advancement? So that's how I think about strategic planning. First, looking big picture at an industry. What does an industry look like? Can you tell me about the major forces and dynamics at work at a specific moment in time? And then, once you have a good sense of where you're operating, what game you're playing, then you start to ask the follow-up questions. What are you, as an organization, specifically going to do to operate within that landscape? Where will you compete? How will you do it? And when? Until recently, that's kind of where I stopped thinking about strategy. I really thought of it as an organizational practice, and really almost as a conversation, some soul searching that good, highly performing organizations do routinely to figure out if they're on the right track and what track they want to be on. Recently, after I started working at the University of Missouri, I got to know my new dean, Tmkeen, really well. He's a seasoned businessman. He's worked around the world. Most recently, he had been at a university in Singapore, turning things around, and then he was brought to the United States to work in Missouri. Really high energy, energetic man who, above everything, cares about people. He's worked at big companies, but ultimately he was never very convinced with anything at the organizational level. He didn't want to hear, where are we going to compete, how are we going to compete, when are we going to compete. All he wanted to know is, what are you passionate about? What is your dream? For him, the strategic planning process didn't start at the industry level or even at the company level. It started at the individual level. Who are you, and what is your dream? What is your passion? So I wanted to show you his approach to strategic planning as an alternative to the one that I've been trained in and that a lot of organizational leaders have been trained in. He would always talk about a 7-step process.